So thank you all very much for being here. I know some of you were, as Wendy said, out late last night, so making a 9 o'clock start is difficult. And thank you, Maya, for that introduction. I often think that the very best introductions mean that I don't really have to say very much because she said it all, but I will anyway. I should start by making one thing clear. I know less about farming in Canada than every single person in this room. I have, however, spent 40 years or so writing about peasant farming around the world at various times and places. This research has convinced me of two things, as Maya suggested in the introduction. Peasant farmers have been in the past and continue to be the most efficient in all the ways that efficiency counts. That is, they use land most efficiently and sustainably. They do the best job of maintaining soil fertility. They use water more efficiently, and they get the most product and the most diverse range of products from the land. They're able to do this because they employ more labor per acre than others, and because they rely on an intimate knowledge of their land and its promise. The second thing that this has informed me of, that this has suggested to me, is that despite the common tale of woe and poverty usually associated with peasants, peasant livelihoods have been and continue to be very often full of the most important things people constantly claim are the most important for a good life: community, family, sense of belonging, quiet self-reliance. So, this is getting in my way. Can you hear me if that's out there? Okay, then I won't. Okay. So, I'm a historian. Historians are obsessed with two things. We tell stories and we're wedded to our evidence. So I would like to tell you a story to back up what I just suggested and to illustrate what I just suggested, and give you a little taste of the evidence I use to be able to tell you that story. The story I have chosen comes from England in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And this is appropriate, perhaps, because this was in some ways the beginning of very large-scale, capital-intensive farming. The moment is really a century, from 1750 to, and don't worry, I'm not going to give you the whole century, from 1750 to 1850, when English agriculture first becomes obsessed with the wonders of capital and size. And it has been described as the agricultural revolution. So what I want to do is relate the costs of that revolution. A century of increasing poverty, malnutrition, and hunger, of increased mortality and homelessness that afflicted the majority of the English population precisely because this obsession with size, with transforming the art of husbandry into the science of agriculture, as the Economist celebrated in 1843, forced very small farmers from the land. And it did this despite the fact that they were clearly the surest means to arrest the desperate poverty and hunger spreading throughout rural England. Let me outline first briefly what the agricultural revolution entailed, and then I will turn to the lives of English peasants. Most land in England had been owned for centuries by a small group of nobility. Just over 1,000 people owned the majority of the agricultural land in England. They mostly rented out the land in very long-term leases, often measured in lives, for modest rents to relatively small-sized farmers, the English yeomen, farming about 100 acres. These English farmers, these yeomen, employed laborers. Oh, I forgot that I have a clicker here with a thing. Good. Employed laborers, most often called cottagers. And so I'll in this talk be talking about cottagers. And cottagers in England were kind of a combined laborers, peasants, and I'll talk about this a little bit. Labor on these small farms was often a kind of communal shared workspace. Cutting the grain performed to the sounds of Captain's swing, setting the rhythm for cutting the grain. Cottagers received wages, but more important in their livelihoods were small bits of land on which they too farmed, growing food, keeping bees, keeping pigs, and chickens and geese, and if they were lucky, a dairy cow or two. On surprisingly small bits of land, they could provide their family with most of its needs and with lots left over to market in nearby towns. There was also still a significant portion of land in England that was held in common. Common land may have made up about 1/5 of the agricultural land in England in 1750. These non-wage labor options meant agricultural laborers had other means for survival to make a living, and thus they could command higher wages. But gathering steam from the 1750s on, all of these elements began to change. Estate owners were encouraged to use their estates more efficiently, and that should be in quotation marks, efficiently, turn them into income-generating machines, and I quote, sacred to the intended purpose of great and speedy profit, in the words of Arthur Young in an advice manual he wrote for estate owners in 1767. They were admonished, these estate owners, to let their land in much bigger parcels on commercial short-term leases to farmers intent on improved agriculture. Improved agriculture meant getting much bigger and investing heaps of capital. Indeed, all of England was obsessed with the purported wonders of capital. In the words of one critic, by the early 1800s, capital had become, and I quote, the deity of their idolatry, which they had set up to worship in the high places of the Lord. Improved agriculture meant enclosing common lands as well. Between 1750 and 1850, 7 million acres of common land were enclosed by parliamentary decree. This was a complicated process. All of those with established common right theoretically got the amount of land that their common right entitled them to. But the smallest common right holders, and those who had relied on the commons without an established official right to do so, were left out. Wanderers on the world's big common, as one newspaper suggested. Most everyone was enthused about the prospects of the agricultural revolution. Historians, too, have often been blind to the costs of the revolution. Luckily, despite that, we have lots of evidence about the costs of the revolution and the efficiency of the small-scale agriculture the revolution swept away. Let me do a very brief aside about evidence, because as I said, we historians are kind of obsessed with that. Peasants don't often speak for themselves on record. They don't keep account books or often write memoirs. So mostly we rely on others to speak for them, and we kind of piece together their lives from what other people tell us about peasants. Arthur Young, sorry, I keep forgetting I got this. Arthur Young, the handsome fellow on the right here, provides us with some of that evidence. He was an early cheerleader for the agricultural revolution, made an incredible output of books and a journal he wrote from, a journal he published from twice a year from 1784 to 1806. He ensured that publication meant that he was generally considered to be the most knowledgeable writer in English on agriculture. He also became secretary to the very powerful Board of Agriculture and Internal Improvement in 1793 and served there till he died in 1820. But Young in 1795 had a dramatic change of heart. By 1795, alarmed by the poverty that was spreading throughout England, partly as a result of the application of the measures that he had long championed, he became convinced that the only way to arrest that growing poverty was to give cottagers guaranteed access to land of their own. And he called on a few progressive and sympathetic estate owners who were also members of the board to provide details about how cottagers used the land. A deluge of letters came into the board, all published in Young's journal. One of the wonderful things that historians get to do is to read these old journals forever. So what I thought was going to be a couple of weeks' time worked out to be about 4 years of time reading through the Annals of Agriculture and Internal Improvement. They were huge. They published twice a year, often running to a couple of thousand pages. I learned more about the prospects of using carrots to feed pigs than I ever wanted to know. But in the process, we also got some of this really interesting stuff. The other fellow here, William Cobbett, the guy on the left, was a farmland lad who almost accidentally got drafted into the army. He ran away from home, jumped on the back of the truck, and was in the army. Spent some time in New Brunswick, returned dedicated to campaigning against corruption in high places in the army, spent time in prison, in exile in America, in Parliament, but always longed to return to some version of his family farm. He found it when he bought a small farm in Botley, the most delightful village in the world, he said, with neither workhouse, nor barber, nor attorney, nor justice of the peace. I'm not quite sure what he had against barbers. Right? He spent lots of time in the early 1800s traveling through the countryside, recounting the lives of the rural poor and talking about growing poverty. And he wrote about them in a number of our books, and he also published a magazine, a journal. There were also a few ministers in poor parishes and one notable rural doctor who provide us with all sorts of evidence about cottager productivity and the perils of the agricultural revolution. So what does this evidence tell us about the agricultural revolution and the situation of English peasants or cottagers during that century, the century of the widespread triumph of English agriculture? The new commercial approach to farming initiated a series of harms that afflicted cottagers and commoners, some small and some catastrophic harms. One of these small harms was what happened to gleaning. By custom, the rural poor had the right to glean grain in the fields left over after harvest. Though time-consuming, such cleaning could provide for grain for a family for a couple of months. Newly industrialized farms restricted gleaning, often to allow livestock to graze in the newly harvested lands. Almost certainly, however, the most harmful aspect of the agricultural revolution was the way it deprived cottagers of the land. Let's pause to meet a few of them now. Sir Thomas Bernard was one of the sympathetic estate owners I mentioned. He had often passed a very small farm near Tadcaster on his travels to London. One day in 1798, he stopped to inquire about the farm and its owner. According to Bernard's note to Young, the farm was rented by a now 67-year-old man named Brinton Abbott and his wife. His wife's unnamed in the account. It consisted of a cottage and a rood of land, and a rood of land was a quarter of an acre. And I quote, "enclosed by a hedge containing the cottage, 15 apple trees, 1 green gage, 3 wine sour plum trees, 2 apricot trees, several gooseberry and currant bushes, abundance of common vegetables, and 3 hives of bees." Abbott and his wife of 45 years got 40 bushels of potatoes from the quarter acre, raised 7 children, and, according to Bernard, lived very happily together. Abbott had been thrown off a different piece of land during an enclosure about 2 decades earlier. He had spent some time in desperate poverty, reliant on the insecurity of poor and sporadic wages, until he had the good fortune of getting his rood of land from Squire Fairfax at steady rent. He did agricultural work for the squire, but the key to his happy life was his carefully tended rood of land and his cottage. Bernard's note contributes to a long list of such descriptions, highlighting the remarkable productivity of small plots of land. Many of these reports stress how much more productive such small farms were than the larger, more capital-intensive farming surrounding them. Sir Henry Vavasour, for example, described a small farm held by a fellow named Thomas Rooke and his wife, also unnamed in the account. You're getting a pattern there, I'm sure. He had 3 acres, rented for many decades now. Rooke kept 2 cows and 2 pigs and made his whole rent in the butter he sold. According to Vavasour, and I quote, "It is very evident that this man clears from his 3 acres more than a farmer can possibly lay by from more than 80 acres in the common husbandry of the country." These reports also make clear that English peasants did a better job of sustaining the fertility of the soil than large farmers. Large farmers at this point are desperately importing guano from the Pacific and other places to try to maintain the fertility of their land. In 1806, Sir William Putney, in a note to Young, described the small plot of an unnamed couple on his estate. He, the husband of the couple, worked as a collier. His wife did most of the work on the farm. She paid 3 shillings rent, had the land for 3 lives, which was essentially 99 years, had been there for 18 years, had 6 children. She planted corn, potatoes, and garden stuff. She raised a pig each year, fed on kitchen scraps, and sold each January. She got better yields than the neighboring large farmers. Putney said that he had given them the plot of land partly because it was very poor soil, unsuitable for normal husbandry. According to Putney, she had improved the land immensely over the years with constant care. She composted whatever she could, even collecting manure from the neighboring roads for the land. Another estate owner, a fellow named Babington, said that the land on his estate held by cottagers had improved remarkably. And I quote, "They have always plans on foot for increasing the fertility of their little spots." All of this is not surprising, given the wonderful complexity of English peasant farming. In 1802, Arthur Young, based on his conversations with cottagers all over England, published a calendar for suggesting planting times for what he said customarily went into a cottage garden. He suggested dates for planting, and try to remember all of these: radishes, parsley, beans, cabbages, shallots, leeks, carrots, potatoes, turnips, onions. I have onions twice. Parsnip and kidney beans. He advised keeping bees and pigs. Indeed, one commentary a few years later suggested life without a pig was unthinkable. And fertilizing using, and Young went on, fertilizing using compost from everything left over from the kitchen. Nor was Young alone in this. Charles Hall, a country doctor, described a typical cottage garden in his district as having wheat, barley, potatoes, turnips, peas, calico corn, flax, cabbage, and beets. It was this care and diversity and complexity that allowed English peasants to build lives of prudent abundance from very small bits of land. As one estate owner said, "The difference betwixt the situation of those as possess or occupy land and such as have none is very wide. Instead of going to the market to buy provisions, he frequently has there to sell his abundance." Or, as the Reverend David Davies recounted, describing the changes in his parish in Barkham in 1795, "The depriving of the peasantry of all landed property has beggared multitudes. An amazing number of people have been reduced from a comfortable state of partial independence to the precarious condition of hirelings." It wasn't just peasants who suffered from this transition. Markets in rural towns withered as cottagers no longer had goods to sell in the market. And all of the accompanying services, from blacksmith to cooper to cobbler, slowly moved away from rural towns. As wheat took over the countryside, hunger and malnutrition followed along. Life expectancy fell. Even the average heights declined. English people were their tallest in 1740, according to all of our records. Life expectancy fell. An investigation presented to Parliament in the 1860s reported that 1/2 of the agricultural laborers suffered from chronic malnutrition. In the headlong rush to improve agriculture, dependent on large farms and heaps of capital, these accounts were largely ignored. Instead, farmers and estate owners sought to enlarge their farms at the expense of the rural poor. The result can be imagined. By the early 19th century, what had once been termed the peaceable kingdom was the scene of almost constant rural unrest. Riots were frequent. Even more frequent was widespread arson, directed primarily at these improving farmers. As William Cobbett attested, there was now, and I quote, "a rooted hatred between the rich and the poor." Or as one letter to farmers in 1844 said, "Gentlemen, I have thought it proper of writing these few words just to show how poor are oppressed in this place. I ask what you may expect but fire Instead of listening to the appeals to stop the war on cottages, to stop expelling the English peasantry from their farms, the government responded in 1834 with changes to the poor law, covering the countryside with humongous poor or workhouses designed purposefully to be the horrendous options for the poor, and further criminalizing poverty. As one inmate recorded, "I sometimes look up to the bit of blue sky high over my head with a tear in my eye, surrounded by walls that are too high to climb, confined like a felon without any crime." England in this century was, of course, just one example. It is but one of a multitude that we could recount from diverse places around the world and diverse time periods. All of them suggest the two ideas I started with. Peasants everywhere have proven themselves to be the most efficient farmers, using little bits of land to grow the most product and the most diverse range of products. They have everywhere used this productivity and this independence to build livelihoods that are often full of abundance in the things they all say they value most. As I also said at the beginning of the talk, I know less about farming in Canada than everyone in this room, so I would leave it to you to consider your stories and whether they have any relevance here and today. Thank you.